Blackhawks fans, welcome back to another episode of the Four Feathers podcast. This is season 6, episode 14, and today's title, Tony, I think very appropriate. A's are only for effort. And we'll get into everything hockey related here in just a moment. But before we get started, as always, want to remind everybody, like, subscribe, and hit the bell button over on the On Tap Sports YouTube channel. You know, when our show and all of our other great shows go live. In addition, be sure to follow the podcast over at Four Feathers Pod on the socials. And of course, we appreciate any 5-star ratings you're willing to give us wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. And if we're not doing 5-star worthy work, let us know and we can improve the product at hand. Skokes says, dudes, we're a bunch of dudes. And this is my dude, Mr. Tony Marchese. Sir, first off, hashtag crack 'em. Second off, how are you doing, my friend?
I'll crack one with you, Ron. Cheers, my friend. Happy, what is it, Tuesday? I'm still all messed up. I'm still all messed up from the holidays, man. I don't know about you. It was getting a little weird in the scheduling there, but happy Tuesday, and glad to be talking Blackhawk hockey with you. It's we got a lot to get to today, Ron. I want to talk a little bit about our Winter Classic experience.
Definitely.
Some up and down. I think our last episode was Jekyll and Hyde's. Same stuff going on with the Hawks right now, and there's just all sorts of, I don't know, you want to call it nonsense, Ron?
We'll call it nonsense for now.
We'll call it nonsense. There's a lot to get to, Ron. So I'm doing good. We're gonna get through a couple of really good topics. I think this should be some good discussion. I'm excited for it. But cheers to everybody out there. Thank you for everybody tuning in. And Ron, what do we got on the docket today?
Indeed. What do we have on the docket, Tone? Well, as we noted, the title of today's show is A's are only for effort. And why we say that? Well, Tony, you and I saw a couple of really bad losses in person. One being the Sunday game against the Dallas Stars. Actually, I don't know if you were able to make that one, but I know I was at that game. You were at that game. You were at that game.
I was there. It was a painful day for me.
It was a painful day for you, but I will say a humongous shout out to Stuart, who we got to meet in person all the way from Belfast.
Yes.
At the stadium. He and his lovely bride were hanging out with us in the intermissions. We talked to them before the game as well. So super duper awesome shout out. Despite the outcome of that game, that was really, really fun, really, really cool. So it wasn't all bad in that 6-1 loss to the Stars, but then we watched them turn around and absolutely get their brakes blown off by the St. Louis Blues at Wrigley Field. They just didn't come ready to play, frankly. And the ice seemed to be awful for the Hawks and not awful for the Blues. And then, Tone, as you mentioned, a little bit of Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde play from the Hawks. Big win against the Canadiens. I was in attendance for that game on Friday night.
That's the one I missed.
It is the game you missed. So maybe we're a little bit of a topsy-turvy here. You know, I'm going to games by myself. They're winning. You're not at the game. I don't know, Tone. I don't know.
That's what was happening earlier this year, though.
It was.
So, I mean, I'm the first half guy. You're the second half guy, and maybe you just got to carry the torch here.
Maybe. And then after that 4-2 win, unfortunately, another 6-goal effort from an opponent in that 6-2 loss that we just saw here from the Hawks against the Rangers on Sunday. So, I mean, Tony, you said it perfectly to kind of ignite the conversation here is this Blackhawks team is still giving up and down efforts. Now, Sunday and Tuesday, this being of last week, obviously. So for those that were also screwed up with days, because I agree, Tony, time didn't exist in that week between Christmas and New Year's, the 29th and the 31st. So New Year's Eve, obviously the Winter Classic, horrendous games from the Blackhawks, no sense of urgency. And it felt like it took a multitude of things happening, Tony. It took the team looking themselves in the mirror after the Winter Classic and saying, wow, these fans paid a ton of money to be here at Wrigley Field to watch us just get our doors blown off. But also there are rumblings and rumors and reports, and whether or not they're real or not, we will never know, that Kyle Davidson kind of lit into the team after the Winter Classic game and was pretty much deeming the effort that was given unacceptable. And again, all tying it back to today's episode title because it feels very appropriate for where this team stands at the moment. It seemed like they got that together, Tony, in that Montreal game and then lost it again in the New York game. But it was nice to see against the Canadiens, a very kind of surging Canadiens team. They've been very good recently. It was nice to see the Blackhawks come out and put up an effort. But, Tone, what the hell is going on with this team? Why can they not get up for games, especially when it's a team loaded with veterans who should be able to get up for big games, especially a game like the Winter Classic?
Ron, this is the same shit we've been seeing all year. I mean, yes, there's a veteran presence on this team, but I think one has to question at this point whether or not some of these veteran guys want to be here and be part of this. It's embarrassing when you have a record that the Blackhawks do. And I get it. It's the dog days of January right now.
13, 25, and 2, in case anybody was curious.
I'm going back to the Nick Foligno comments after the win against the Canadiens. It was good to hear, right? Like, we had to look ourselves in the mirror. We're going to play the Blackhawk hockey that you expect. I think these are all great comments. The fan base needed to hear from someone on the team, and I think the captain having a good game against Montreal, and I believe he was named the first star and did the interview after the game. That was a good moment for, I think, Hawks fans and the team themselves. But we should have never really reached this point, Ron. It shouldn't have gotten as bad as it did, and that's what still bothers me. And you look at a statement like that from your captain, I think a statement victory after getting your doors blown off. Connor Bedard referred to it as getting dog walked in the Winter Classic. You want the team to have a sustained response to the public embarrassment. And that seemed for a minute there that they did have that. It seemed like they were going to turn a page with the new year and start to play differently. But then they go in against this New York Rangers team that I believe they've beaten already once this season. And you had basically a repeat of what happened in the Winter Classic. So I don't know if the message isn't just sinking into the team at large, if there's multiple components that are broken. I've looked up and down this veteran roster, and while a lot of guys are underperforming, you don't really see the lack of care on the ice. Tyler Bertuzzi scoring goals. He's been a little bit, I think you might want to call him resurgent of late, a couple multi-goal efforts. Teuvo Teravainen has maybe left a little bit to be desired, Ron. Pat Boone has been a glue guy. Yes, he's slow, but you see the effort from him, and he's willing to drop the gloves. And I just don't know where that problem exists, Ron. I can tell you that the defense is a different story.
Sure.
Your guy Seth Jones has taken a lot of heat still. I don't know what the actual problem is. I can't seem to diagnose it. Ron, do you have any idea of what could possibly be happening? Because it's maddening to watch. And I think that there's a lot of comments out there, and some of them are a little out there for my liking about certain things with this roster construction. We'll get to some of that later. But it's not like these are like a group of hateable guys, right? It'd be one thing. I already went through a full season watching a baseball team full of guys that like were easy to not root for with the White Sox. I think you just got done with a Bear season where there was plenty to like point out and say, this is wrong. With the Hawks, it kind of feels a little bit different, man. I can't put my finger on it. There's no, outside of Seth Jones, man, who's the punching bag here? You already got rid of Luke Richardson. You never saw a new coach bump. That was concerning. And I had comments about Nick Foligno that, I wasn't really crazy about the way that he was going about business up until I think the first time we really saw him shine through as a captain was against the Montreal Canadiens. So I don't know where that is. Is Nick Foligno part of the problem?
I think, Tone, I'm gonna stop you before you talk yourself in circles here, because I think there is an answer, and it requires kind of backing up a little bit. It requires kind of looking at this from probably more of a 20,000-foot view. We got a comment here from Dean, and he says, they're lazy, no stopping and starting. They glide. Even the national broadcaster said so. I agree. That's a current problem, right? That's a present day issue as of January 7th, 2025. But I think this issue began back in probably early November Because, Tony, we here at Four Feathers Podcast have what we'd like to call Games They'll Want Back Tracker.
Yes, we do.
Tony, you know something that's interesting about our Games They'll Want Back Tracker?
We stopped adding to it.
None of them have happened since Luke Richardson got fired. I think what happened was this team had a lot of close games early on in the season, heightened expectations, not only from the fan base, but also from the front office. And at the end of the day, when you've got 7 games in the first month and change, we'll call it, because obviously October is not a full month of hockey for these guys. Month and change, you have 7 games that you could already argue they should have won. That's demoralizing for a hockey team when through a month and change, you only probably played about 20 games at that point. Almost half of your games could have gone the other way and put you in a better spot. So I think what happened is the team lost a lot of confidence and morale at that point in the season.
They lost a lot. 3-2 games is what happened there.
Exactly. And now I think you're just seeing the, I guess, byproduct, we'll call it, of a team that you mentioned Seth Jones maybe being the punching bag. I think this whole team's been a punching bag because it feels like these guys have lost the wind in their sails ever since Richardson was fired, because Richardson got fired and you didn't see a lot of guys being happy and go lucky about it. A lot of guys were like, he's a great guy. We'll miss him. Like, I think there was a lot of appreciation for Luke Richardson. Remember, this was the man that Max Domi was begging to play for because of the time that he had with him in Montreal. I think they are just full-blown demoralized. And then at the same time, you bring in Sorensen, who sure has a little bit of rapport with some of the young guys, Frank Nazar, maybe a Colton Dock now, but that's about it. Most of these guys don't know Anders Sorensen to the point where they're just kind of defeated already at this point in the season. And at this point in the year, you're now nowhere close to the playoffs. Playoffs are not even, I think, a question for these guys. At this point, I think it's just a lot of guys are just playing for that next contract. Taylor Hall's a free agent at the end of this season. I got more names for you here. Philip Kurashev, who we haven't even seen sniff the lineup recently, is a restricted free agent after this year. Ryan Donato is a free agent. Pat Maroon is a free agent. Craig Smith is a free agent. Alec Martinez, who we still haven't seen in a while, is a free agent. There are a lot of guys on this team. And then Andreas Athanasiou, who obviously is buried right now, but is still a free agent at the end of the season. I think a lot of these guys are just playing either to get traded at the deadline or to find a new home in the summertime when the season's over, because outside of your young group of Alex Vlasics and Connor Bedard's of the world, none of these guys are probably here beyond maybe next season. And Dean's got a comment here. He says, another comment on the coaching situation. Why did Kyle Davidson only fire Luke and not the other coaches? Because it's too hard to replace a full coaching staff midseason. And that happens with a lot of teams, right? Where they'll bring in a new head coach. He works with the current assistants. And then after that season, you see assistants get turned over and they become his guys if he sticks. Think Jim Montgomery right now with the St. Louis Blues. They've all worked with these guys. They wanted to probably keep some kind of continuity. I think Kyle Davidson hit a little bit of the panic button and fired Luke Richardson. Now, whether or not maybe it is for the greater good of this team long-term, that remains to be seen. But Tony, I don't think this is a problem of what are they doing wrong now? It's what did they do wrong 3 months ago that is now carrying over to now that we're seeing the byproduct of that under the ice, because this team isn't having the effort they need to win hockey games. They come firing in one game and you see what happens. Foligno, 2 goals. They get a big 4-2 win over a respectable Montreal Canadiens team. I'm not going to call them world beaters, but at least a respectable hockey club. And everybody's feeling good. Arvid Soderblom looked fantastic. 38 saves on 40 shots. Made some huge high danger saves too at the end of that second period in that game. But it was just a blip on the radar. And now it's, well, how do you get that consistently out of some of these guys? And where does that fire need to come from? And I think that is maybe the more important question than what's going wrong. It's how do we re-spark the fire that this team, in my opinion, once had early in the season. They were playing enjoyable hockey in those first handful of games, and then they just started losing close ones. And I really think that just demolished and fully demoralized this hockey club.
It's a really good point you bring up. And it has been interesting that we haven't had a game fall onto our games they'll want backtracker.
Yep.
I remember towards the end of November, we talked a little bit about where this team could be had some of these games gone their way. And I think we even said, let's take, half of them, 4 of them, and throw that into the Hawks win-loss record at the time. And the team would have looked absolutely just night and day better as far as the record was at the point. I do subscribe to this theory, though, Ron, that if they had won some of these, maybe you see a different swagger with them. Maybe you see a little bit more confidence. Man, you brought up a lot of names that are not going to be here next year. And I would venture to guess that there's some creeping thoughts that, hey, like, I'm not going to give everything I need to every single night, risking my health for a hockey team that's going to finish, if not dead last in the NHL for another season in a row, somewhere near the bottom 4 of the league. That's where they're headed. But overall, I think just the embarrassment that the Winter Classic shined a light on Chicago hockey is probably the low moment in something that Kyle Davidson a year ago probably thought that this was going to be a pinnacle moment. I fully believe that Davidson and Bettman probably had these conversations about a year ago. Connor Bedard is obviously the star product that they wanted to showcase in this year's Winter Classic. They wanted to improve the TV ratings. Davidson went out and probably signed some of these veterans to make it respectable after what we watched last year as Hawks fans, to get us to that Winter Classic and have a respectable hockey game that it excited people about the future of the Chicago Blackhawks. This absolutely backfired on them. So I'm happy with the response in the Montreal game, but I'm worried long-term that this message is not going to stick, Ron. That's my biggest fear, is that we start to see this thing tumble even further as we get towards the trade deadline, after the trade deadline. The other thing that's sort of concerning, and I know that, you're probably going to tell me to back off this ledge a little bit, you haven't really seen further development from some of the young guys who've taken that step up into the NHL levels. Your Frank Nazars, who was supposed to provide a spark right after Luke Richardson left, hasn't really provided much to the Blackhawks offense. Lucas Reichel is basically done exactly what Lucas Reichel did last year, with some spurts of promising play, but then largely regulated to the fourth line. That never changed when Luke Richardson left. Why didn't Anders Sorensen prop him up? There's an organizational view on Lucas Reichel at this point in time. You've seen Alex Vlasic basically maintain his status. He's still excellent, but it's not like it's really, you haven't seen much strides of growth there. We've talked about Connor Bedard till we're blue in the face. I think he's fine. It's just not as explosive as it was last season in terms of goal scoring. But where are some of these young guys to step up in that lineup and show just a little bit of promise for Blackhawks fans? Like, hey, this guy can score. This guy can be an offensive weapon. This guy's going to come up and be a defensive non-liability. I mean, even Kevin Korchinski kind of wore out his welcome real fast when he got back up to the NHL level. So there hasn't been a lot of growth stories, Ron. And even in a rebuild, you need those growth stories to say, as a fan, like, okay, I feel that this is headed in the right direction. Now, this is where I'm guessing you'd tell me to back off the ledge. A lot of this is happening in Rockford, and people aren't watching Rockford Ice Hogs hockey. They're watching Chicago Blackhawks hockey. They see that show up on their social media feeds. They see the anger. They see the masses sort of questioning why this team is so bad. Unfortunately, in Chicago, we've become well too accustomed with bad play and complaining about our sports teams. So the Hawks are in the fire with this, just like every other franchise is in this city. And they don't have a lot of good stories to write home about, Ron. That's my sort of takeaway. Outside of the games that you want back, there hasn't been a positive development story with this team outside of maybe arguably Arvid Soderblom having a comeback season. And even that, if you start to look over the last, I think it's maybe 5 starts, you've seen some cracks in the foundation again with Arvid Soderblom, that you can't really say that it's all been stellar. It's just been better than Peter Mrazek. So I think that there's a lot of steps that they have to take. And I worry that this could be a year that's looked at as a step back instead of a step forward if things don't turn around.
Yeah, I think it's tough, especially with some of the young guys, because I look at a guy like Nazar, and I think I was probably in more of the conservative camp of let him stay in Rockford and keep putting up the points he's putting up, rather than rush him to the NHL. And you're seeing why. He's posted 2 assists. That's the extent of his offensive prowess. He did put up an assist on Sunday. And I will say this, he was very noticeable in that Montreal game. He was everywhere. He wasn't able to necessarily finish on everything, but he was everywhere. I think he's taken some steps. I think the problem with that is a lot of these guys are taking steps, but it's not necessarily on the score sheet. And I think that's more of a byproduct of the roster around them than it is necessarily on the player. So not to say that I don't think people want to continue to see development. I think it would be nice to see a guy like Frank Nazar maybe go on a stretch where he pots 3 or 4 goals in like a 7 to 10 game span, right? Like, I think those would still be welcomed. I wouldn't be shocked. You and I were talking about this the other day separately from the show. Maybe there's a world where Frank Nazar goes back to Rockford, kind of like a Kevin Korchinski did. I think that's completely possible. But I will say this. I like the addition of Colton Dach to this roster. Got to see him debut live and in person on Friday. And despite not having a goal or an assist or anything like that, 5 hits, 5 shots on goal, 3 scoring chances, and they gave him some power play time. Like he's the guy that I'm a little bit maybe more kind of keen on, because Doc's been around longer. He's a little bit older. He has a lot more seasoning under his belt.
A little more physical play too.
Yes, and that's something they absolutely need, as Dean calls out here in the comments. He says they also don't play physical and they don't finish checks. Dickinson, Foligno, and Dach were the 3 guys on that Friday win that were going around and finishing checks. And that was important. And I agree with that statement. That has been my biggest pet peeve of this Blackhawks team, is the fact that, especially guys who you pay to finish checks, Tyler Bertuzzi, for example, haven't been finishing checks when they should be. And at the end of the day, I think there's a chance for development. The problem with the development of a lot of these guys is, outside of Colton Dach, who was drafted in 2021, all these guys have just been drafted within the last 2 years. Not everybody rushes to the NHL right away. The fact that Frank Nazar is already in the NHL is actually quite surprising, if we're being completely frank. Because even in that draft class, if you look at the top 10 picks from Bedard's class, only 4 of them have seen NHL action so far. So Nazar is ahead of the game, and that's why I think he probably needs to go back to Rockford and dominate some more, because he still had cracks in his game even at the AHL level. Dach, I think, is a little different. I think they can give an extended run on Dach because, A, Doc's a winger, easier position to play in the NHL than center is, and B, he brings something that the Hawks don't have right now, which is a physical element to the roster. And Nazar's not that guy. Dean says he agrees about Nazar. Let him and Dach finish in Rockford and get in the playoffs, try to have success. And I think that will happen. Don't get me wrong. I think Colton Dach was brought up as a reward for his good play. 25 points in 30 games with Rockford and a very balanced stat line, 12 goals, 13 assists. He's been very good for the Ice Hawks this year. So as we saw with Korchinski, right, getting that, hey, you've been playing well, we're going to reward you, but as soon as somebody comes back and is healthy, you're going back to Rockford. I think that might come sooner than later with Nazar. I think that might come sooner than later with Dach. But it's still important for those guys, I think, to get to the NHL and feel out where they're missing in their game, of where they need to succeed, because then that's valuable information that you get from a first-person standpoint that you can then turn around and apply to your game in Rockford. So I know it's hard, and trust me, and I have more on this later when it comes to ruffling feathers, because I'm sure I'm about to ruffle probably 85% of the fan base today. Development takes time. And when we're only really in the second year of the rebuild, because Davidson wasn't named GM officially until 2022. So I guess you're in year 3 of the rebuild technically. You're not really starting to see a lot of the prospects yet, because they're just too young and not experienced enough yet to get the call. So that's kind of the ugly moment, we'll call it, right? of this rebuild right now is we're kind of in that weird small point where guys are getting close, but they're not quite there yet to come up and make an impact at the NHL level. And I think that's what's frustrating fans, which is understandable, especially when you look around the rest of the roster and the veterans that are here are not really putting up points the way they should be. Not a shot at the guy, but Ryan Donato has the second most amount of goals on the Chicago Blackhawks this season, behind only Tyler Bertuzzi. There's only 4 players on this team that have double-figure goals. The other 3 being Connor Bedard, as we mentioned, Bertuzzi, Donato, Bedard, Foligno. That's it. So something to keep in mind. We're frustrated with the youth. But what about the veterans that are supposed to keep their spots warm and at least bring and help establish that culture? I think that's what we should be a little bit more worried about than these young guys coming up and needing to be saviors and supermen when they're not ready for that yet.
It goes back to this, man, at least for me. Like, I want to see that early success. It just feels like we're not seeing a lot of it. And I agree, the veterans need to be better. That's what they were brought in to do. But not a lot of these guys are like star players that are going to find the back of the net a ton of times. I'm a little upset with Bertuzzi and Teravainen's production levels, sure. But, I mean, did we really expect these guys to be 30-plus goal scorers a year? I mean, I'm not sure what your projections were.
Bertuzzi's on pace to score 29.
So are we upset with Bertuzzi?
I don't think it's so much a numbers thing, Tone, as more as it is.
Is it an optics thing?
I think it's an optics thing. I think that's really what it is here, because like Dean says in the comments, the veterans should have come here and wanted to play well to get moved at the deadline. Because, Tony, to your point, maybe these guys aren't the star players on their teams or the flashy goal scorers, but these are guys that can help teams that are going for cup runs. These are those exact type of players. They should want to play well with a chance of helping establish a culture in Chicago while maybe having a chance to go for another title. And a lot of them are playing themselves out of that chance, just as Dean says here. Now, what team in the league would want any of them? Who's going to want Taylor Hall? Who's going to want Andreas Athanasiou? The only guy I would argue that's a free agent after the season, I would argue Smith and Maroon would be wanted by teams for maybe low draft picks because they're older, one-year deals. They'd be like fourth-line guys, but they're still showing something. And then probably Ryan Donato, because he's on pace to have some of the best numbers of his NHL career in a contract year, and he's always young, and he plays all 3 forward spots, and he's probably going to be a nice addition to somebody for a playoff run. But that's it. Unless you're trading for an additional year of Jason Dickinson, or you're trading for an additional year of Nick Foligno, or an additional, like a lot of these guys are on these weird 2-year deals or 3-year deals that you kind of got to start weighing those games. Even a Philip Kurashev.
Well, I think part of the problem too, Ron, is the goalpost. I'm not saying they've completely moved, but when we were evaluating this a year ago,
they've moved.
When we were evaluating this a year ago, the goalposts seemed to start to appear. I didn't even think that there were any at that point, but you started to see Kyle Davidson lock some talent up, like Nick Foligno, like Peter Mrazek, giving some longer-term contracts. You go into the offseason, you get Bertuzzi additional years. You get a couple of these guys in where you start to say, okay, the pieces are starting to fit together. Then over the course of the last few years, the Hawks have moved the players that, let's call it, give a shit. Your Colin Blackwell's, your Ryan Donato is this year's version of it. And you end up removing a lot of the grit and the sandpaper from this team. And it's really hard for a team to continue to have that identity when you're constantly subtracting, one of the guys from a lineup that provides the most energy and spark. The guys that get the fan base going in a game, the guys that make the UC roar when they finish a check. I don't want to say he's stripped some of this away, but you look at where we were last year. We were talking about this, and you had started to say, we're entering the next phase of the rebuild. Maybe not the competitive phase, but a new phase in the rebuild where you're starting to identify who and what this roster is going to look like over a 3-year span, maybe, versus we're just continuously loading up on guys that we can flip at the deadline. I would argue that right now that plan has completely backfired, because when we're sitting here talking right now in January, a couple of months right now still away, or what is it, 2 months now away from the trade deadline, and we're talking about now nobody's even going to want some of these guys outside of Ryan Donato, who's having a career year. It sort of tells me that we've taken a step back, Ron, and that's what's concerning to me, is that a guy like Ryan Donato, yes, he's going to net you some assets, but let's be real. One of the most assets that we've had over the course of the last few seasons has been draft picks. Kyle Davidson's really great at acquiring draft capital. I don't think that is even up for debate. But how do you get to this point? And it's like, okay, we're flipping off Ryan Donato to a contender. It's probably going to net you what? At max, a second round pick, probably more likely a third. What value are we getting back out of that? Why not re-sign Ryan Donato? Because I think if this team was performing as they were designed to, maybe a middle of the pack team, you might be looking at keeping a guy like Ryan Donato around instead of shipping him off because he's the only guy that teams might have interest in. That's where it concerns me a lot, man. And I'm sure there's other people out there that are concerned with it as well. It feels like this year has been a step back instead of a step forward. And call a spade a spade, Connor Bedard's play hasn't exactly warranted, like, okay, he's taken another step. It's been a struggle to get him to the point where it's like, okay, we see what you had last season. I'm not saying Connor Bedard's bad. Luke Richardson didn't ruin Connor Bedard. Connor Bedard doesn't hate it in Chicago. By all accounts, none of that has been officially spoken. However, if Connor Bedard was lighting the world on fire right now, I think a lot of some of these other problems don't find themselves under the microscope because you probably have a couple extra wins.
Tony, I hate to do this to you, but I'm going to flip your argument on its head here, because I think the optics are distracting from the facts. Yes, things haven't gone as planned, but the locking up talent and trying to get guys here, they did that. Now, did they do it for the right players? We don't know. But Teuvo Teravainen got 3 years in free agency. Bertuzzi got 4. And when they did keep guys like Foligno and Dickinson and Mrazek, it was more from a veteran leadership standpoint than a talent standpoint. Because I would argue 37-year-old Nick Foligno is not a guy who's going to move the needle. But this also goes to show, and this is just a hockeyism in general. There is no sport more important to team play than hockey. Because Connor McDavid played in Edmonton for how many years before they finally made the playoffs, even though he was a damn good player. Because you had to build the team around him. You had to find that talent to fill out at least 3 forward lines with competitive scoring ability. The Blackhawks don't have that right now. Connor Bedard's still producing at a 35-point in 40-game clip. He's on a 7-game point streak with 9 points in those 7 games. So I would argue the fact Connor Bedard is not the problem. The problem being is the guys that they were hoping were going to mesh with Bedard, Tyler Bertuzzi and Teuvo Teravainen, have largely not been able to do that so far. So I think, yes, we have entered another phase of the rebuild, but it's not anywhere near complete. It's not just a 1-year Band-Aid. It is a 3-year plan. Last year's free agency class was not that great outside of like Jake Gensel at the top. This year's free agency class has an opportunity to be a little bit better. Now, granted, there's a lot of guys that are probably going to get re-signed by their teams and things like that. But if there's a year where Kyle Davidson can start to take some more calculated risks, I think, with longer-term contracts, it might be this year. And you also got to remember, they also have to figure out what is Bedard going to cost. Because at the end of the day, he's going to be your biggest contract no matter what. So I don't think we're going to get the answer to how are they going to fill out this roster probably until like the end of next season. But there's an opportunity this summer to continue to make headway. And I think they're going to, because I think they're going to clear out a lot of names at this year's deadline, unlike last season, right? Because all the guys we thought they were going to trade, they ended up locking up and keeping for additional years. I think there's a chance that we see that, but I don't know necessarily if I think the panic button being hit right now is out of impatience more than it is out of where the team is actually going. Because again, we don't know what these prospects are going to become. We don't know if Kyle Davidson's going to move some guys maybe in trades. We've seen GMs get aggressive. Vegas is a perfect example of that, where teams will get aggressive and start to move some assets that they acquired early on, in whether it's their rebuild or their franchise's existence in the Golden Knights case. I think there's a world where you could see that. Elias Pettersson is supposedly available from Vancouver. Has Kyle Davidson kicked the tires on that? Maybe he has. There's a lot more things that need to happen, but unfortunately, they valued veteran leadership over pure talent. And I think that's where the Blackhawks are having their frustrations, because it's not, oh, these guys are coming in and playing a little bit better. Like the Blackhawks teams that Kane and Taves walked into were far more talented than this team is in terms of what was brought in to be a part of the roster.
They walked into a roster that was already largely defined.
Nah, not quite. I wouldn't call it defined. I would say
you had more
talented. Yes, they came in.
You had NHL level defensemen that had been in the system for a little bit there before they were drafted. You already had a Patrick Sharp, a goal scorer on the roster,
who only got there in 2006, mind you, and nobody knew what he was.
Well, there was still 3 years of Patrick Sharp in there before you get to 2009 and you unite everybody up there and actually make a serious run. So,
but Patrick Sharp wasn't Patrick Sharp at that point when they acquired him, is my point, Tony.
Oh, sure. Yes. That's
fair. If we're being brutally honest, the Blackhawks hit on a lot of important draft picks, and ultimately it led down the road to them putting it all together and it working out when the team was really fucking bad. It was a lot of luck, if we're being horrendously honest. It's there is no formula to this. It's a lot of throw shit at the wall and see what sticks. And unfortunately for the Hawks right now, a lot of shit's just not sticking. And there's going to have to be time for, I think, Kyle Davidson to look in the mirror as well this summer and say, how do we improve this roster to start trending in that right direction? Because clearly the moves we made last offseason didn't work out the way we expected.
You're going to have to make some changes then if Kyle Davidson wants to do that. And I don't think it's going to be as easy as everybody's going to make it out to be to try and change that around, just due to the contracts that some of these veteran leadership guys have. But I think you're going to see a very different roster next year. I just don't know if it's going to be much better than this one. And you talk about people being impatient right now. Yes, people are impatient. I'm impatient too. I'm tired of watching all of my favorite teams get their shit kicked in nonstop.
Likewise.
I mean, that's where, Ron, I think, like, if there was a team in the city that, actually put together a winning product, they'd become everybody's go-to team. There'd be a ton of energy around it. The Hawks have the chance to sort of do that, I think, a little bit faster than most other organizations in the city, maybe outside of the Chicago Bears, if they have some sort of magical overhaul. But I only compare the two because they both had first overall picks within the last 3 years. And I think people are just overall frustrated with the state of sports in Chicago. They want to see a team contend. And when you have a 19-year-old Connor Bedard skating around with a generational talent label, it's going to come with the downside of that, which is if he's not performing at a level where he's scoring highlight reel goals on a consistent basis once a week, if not every other week, and being the poster boy for the NHL media account, and everybody else getting their video reposts of Connor Bedard doing something special consistently. You don't have that hope that you had last year surrounding this team. And so it feels toxic, man. It feels fucking toxic around Blackhawks hockey right now. You had the episode of, Spittin' Chicklets, and they're talking about how they lined 5 pucks up on the blue line and had the guys go skate around there, and they couldn't leave the ice until they scored, and it took 35 minutes for them, and they only put 1 puck in the back of the net. It's like stories like that don't need to make it out there. And the only way that you change that is with better play. And it's going to continue to snowball into negative storylines that surround the team. Well, your casual hockey fan's going to take that, and they're not as tuned in as probably someone who listens to this show on a consistent basis or is consuming a ton of content, because when you get viral bad stories about your team, it's embarrassing for the organization. I don't doubt that Kyle Davidson went in that locker room and told them that the effort wasn't there. But the part of the problem is it seems a little bit hypocritical when you go into the locker room and you light all these guys on fire. You're the one that brought them in.
I agree.
You assembled this.
Sure.
You fired their coach a month before the Winter Classic, and you brought up the AHL guy that Jeremy Colleton raves about. That's not a red flag. And that's the thing. There's not even a leader for this team right now. Andersworth's an interim coach. Fine, whatever. But I think that there's a lot of decisions about what that Blackhawks brand of hockey that everybody comes to expect that came out of Nick Foligno's mouth. I don't think they know what the brand of Blackhawks hockey is that they want to play, because they don't even have an established messaging for how they're going to play hockey for the next 4 years.
Sure. And you're completely correct. And that's why it's an important offseason coming up for the Blackhawks. It's important for Kyle Davidson to figure out, what does this team look like a year from now? It's important for him to get the head coaching hire correct this time. Not to say I think Luke Richardson was the worst coaching hire we've ever seen in Chicago sports history by any stretch of imagination, but he was the unfortunate scapegoat of a rebuilding team. And I know we had talked about it years before here on Four Feathers of like, is he just going to be the scapegoat coach when it's all said and done? And he was. It's exactly what happened. But I
think they fired that a little early. Pulled the trigger on
and they might have
Richardson a little.
I mean, in fairness, he was a 3-year deal with a 4th-year option, so he was technically under contract through the rest of this year. So, was it really that early? I don't know, but I think the key is for this offseason is going to be 2 things. One, Kyle Davidson needs to get a respectable head coach in here. Now, whether that's a guy who's done it before and is a name who's well regarded around the league that's available. I'm not entirely sure who's available out there besides a mustached man who's not going to get hired back. And then, though, you can look at another name who is.
Don't tempt me with nostalgia.
Oh, every team in Chicago is tempting you with nostalgia, Tony, as everybody can go check over at OnTapSportsNet.com. The Bulls are going through that right now as we speak. But I think that's where a guy maybe like, and I just wrote up an article over at OnTapSportsNet.com about this yesterday, actually, David Carl, who just won the 2nd consecutive gold medal with Team USA at the World Juniors. He's only 35. He's got a .690 winning percentage as the Denver head coach in 6 seasons there prior to this one coming in. All the dude knows how to do is win. Clearly, he also knows how to work with today's NHL player, right? You hear all these stories about the old guys and the old heads talking and, the NHL's not the same anymore. It's not. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe all these teams are too worried about hiring old head coaches that do it the old way that doesn't work anymore. And maybe you do need to bring in that younger voice that identifies more with today's hockey player. Maybe that's the case. We won't know. But there's a lot that they'll need to figure out because, again, if this play continues, God bless Blackhawks fans because they still continue to pack the United Center despite the team being terrible. They're going to have to, there's going to be some rough games, especially January and February, right? We all know the dog days of the NHL season. it's here, and there's a lot going on. And Tone, I think while we're on the topic here, obviously we mentioned Colton Docks recalled. Still no real major news on Alec Martinez or Laurent Brossoit just yet. Those are the two major injuries for this team. CHSN is still the dumpster fire that it is. That is kind of status quo for the time being in terms of an Xfinity deal, a Hulu deal. Obviously the app is out, etc. But Tony, we were talking about this, about maybe the fan base is going truly mad. Barstool Chiefs talking about maybe not wanting Connor Bedard or having picked 2, 3, or 4 in that draft. Even though Connor Bedard is far superior statistically to every player that was selected in that draft. And Tony, I don't know about you. I don't know. I'm gonna let you go first here, because my response to this is just going to lead us right into ruffling some feathers and in our habitual segment. So I'm going to give you the floor, and then I will go on my tangent when you feel you've exhausted your thoughts.
This one's pretty difficult to digest. And I think that this is sort of, again, just an overreaction to the state of Chicago sports right now. I find it hard to believe that we're in year 2 of the Connor Bedard experience and that statement gets made. I understand that Macklin Celebrini is part of that conversation there as well. If I read the comments correctly, that he had wished that they went 2 or 3 or even 4 in the year with Connor Bedard, and then had the number 1 overall selection. Look, Connor Bedard is a really good hockey player. I think we've established that, Ron. You've seen him play long enough now. You know he's going to be good. Is he going to be Wayne Gretzky? Maybe not. Can he perform to Patrick Kane levels? Maybe he can. He's already breaking and on pace to, I believe, get close to Eddie Olczyk's numbers as a Blackhawks teenager. Already passed Patrick Kane, so we're on a decent pace there. But to sit here and say that you would have rather had Macklin Celebrini when one guy's in year 2 and one guy's in year 1 of their NHL career seems a little early. And I think the response to that, at least from what I've seen online, is fairly to the point that, maybe there's some angst within this Blackhawks fan base. And I think we can all deduce from our show today that there is angst and there's anger and there's not apathy though yet, which is good, because they are still packing the United Center. People are still coming out to watch the Blackhawks play hockey. I'm shocked, to be quite honest with you, that I believe the lowest I've seen the attendance at is somewhere near around 16,000. That's still a pretty good crowd. So for better or for worse, there's eyes on this product. Not as many as there could be if they had an Xfinity CHSN deal right now, but people are still tuning into Blackhawks hockey. I don't know how you can make that statement if you're watching the team and see that Connor Bedard is, as you mentioned earlier, on a pretty decent point streak right now. Still performing. Is he frustrated? Yes, Connor Bedard's frustrated. Is he the next captain of the Blackhawks franchise? I don't know. I don't know if that's the answer. In fact, I wouldn't probably give him that as soon as Nick Foligno's contract's up. I might go captainless again or find a different veteran to come in here and be that guy. Connor Bedard seems to be worried about one thing, and that's winning hockey games, and he's not doing it, and that's where you see the frustration. Does that mean that Macklin Celebrini was going to push this any further than Connor Bedard at this juncture? I don't think so. Even if Macklin Celebrini walked right into this and you had Adam Fantilli on here, yeah, you might have 2 really good guys, but we haven't even seen Artem Levchinov touch the United Center ice yet. And that draft pick's going to take a little bit of time to marinate and get up to the NHL level too. So the only difference is you just have 2 draft picks up in the NHL already, still probably largely surrounded by a group of veteran players that look like this. I don't think it solves anything long-term or short-term had you not lucked into Connor Bedard. In fact, I would argue that if they had a 2 or 3 pick and you had, let's just say it's Fantilli. I'd still be happy with that, but I don't know if the excitement would still be there the way that the Blackhawks transition was made from generational players such as Patrick Kane and Jonathan Taves, and then getting a guy like Connor Bedard that the fans could rally around. I'd argue that the United Center attendance would be a lot worse off until you got into the Macklin Celebrini draft pick, and maybe you started to see a little bit of a turnaround. But I think days could have been a lot darker had you not drafted Connor Bedard. And, at the end of the day, they're still going to need other draft picks, as we've mentioned, to pan out and make the additions to this team to add some scoring. I still go back to this draft, man, and seen a lot of Demidov highlights. Haven't seen Artem Levshinov highlights this year. One guy scores a lot of goals. One guy plays defense. So that's probably part of the reason there. But as you said, I mean, this is far from a finished product. I don't know why you wouldn't want Connor Bedard on your hockey team at this point in time. I just don't. I think that at the end of the day, if Macklin Celebrini even has a better career than Connor Bedard, which is, I mean, hypothetically, that's very possible. But I didn't even want to get into this. Is some of this from the fallout with Jeremy Roenick as well after the Winter Classic thing? Like, Connor Bedard's in the headlines for the wrong reasons right now. And I feel like it's getting to the point where it's pretty fucking stupid that we're having a lot of these conversations that we're having. Man, I want to see this kid succeed so fucking bad at this point and just shut all of this shit down, because I'm out of words, Ron. I'm out of words. That's fair. You have the floor.
Some of the comments here, AJ asking, where do we see the Blackhawks in 10 years? Who knows at this pace? And Dean saying, would you be willing to put up with 12 young players and a couple of vets? Many mistakes, but a bit of brand of hockey. That is going to lead me into my ruffling of feathers. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to GM Ron's class of how player development works in the sport of hockey. It's not the NFL where you can have a draft class of 7 guys that make your fucking roster and make an impact on day one. Hate to break it to you, don't work that way. It's not the NBA where your first and second round picks can be playing as rookies and making the team right away, or maybe your second round guy goes to the G League for a year and then comes up and makes an impact on your roster. Don't work that way. Hockey, as a matter of fact, is probably more like baseball, where these guys can get drafted and you might not see them for 3 or 4 years at the NHL level, because it's a sport that takes time, because you're drafting 18-year-olds. They're fucking kids. They're children. They're not going to be able to play with men right away. The fact that Connor Bedard put up 61 points as an 18-year-old is pretty spectacular. He's going to be just fine. But people need to understand how player development works. And I got a great example for everybody, because this is education time with Ron Luce and my PhD in salary cap fucking geography. Okay? Look at the Blackhawks pre-Kyle Davidson taking over. What was their prospect pool? Absolutely fucking nothing. Because Stan Bowman would have traded it for the last Klondike bar in the box at your local fucking Costco. Okay? Kyle Davidson was starting from effectively Project X. They got Connor Bedard early. And you know what, Tony? As a matter of fact, let's use the team that Macklin Celebrini went to this season. The San Jose Sharks, who magically, right, are doing okay because they have Macklin Celebrini. Well, you know why? Because Macklin Celebrini came in at the end of their rebuild. They are the latter parts of their rebuild than the Blackhawks are. Don't believe me? Let's go through some names. Here's your roster right now. Macklin Celebrini, obviously your first round pick this year. William Eklund, who is tied for the second in points on the San Jose Sharks roster. He was their first round pick, a top 10 selection, in 2021. They went out and got a guy like Tyler Toffoli, player that I really liked in free agency. We actually talked about on this show more than once. They went out and signed him. You went out and traded for Mikhail Granlund and brought him in there. Still really good hockey player. As a matter of fact, has the same amount of points in the same amount of games as Connor Bedard. Weird how that works. Fabian Zetterlund was a young player all the way back from the 2017 draft. They went out and got Jake Wallman, who's a damn good defenseman, for literally almost nothing. I don't know why they got rid of him in Detroit, but that's neither here nor there. Will Smith. Oh, he's a kind of a good hockey player. Oh, that's right. He was a top 5 pick too in 2022. So you see, Macklin Celebrini was like the 5th high draft pick the San Jose Sharks had to get this shit right. The Blackhawks have had 2. They're at a different stage. Yeah, Tony, you fucking nailed it. If Macklin Celebrini was here instead of Connor Bedard, it's actually probably worse than it is currently with Connor Bedard. Macklin Celebrini's a damn good hockey player. I think he's going to have a damn good career. I think Connor Bedard's going to have the better career if you put a gun to my head and told me, bias aside, who the better hockey player is. They are so early. Why do you think Kyle Davidson wants all these draft picks? Because they had no prospect pool to work with. At least it's been consistent in San Jose, and you've had a lot of the same faces in that front office over the years. They hit their rebuild mark when they traded away Joe Thornton and Patrick Marleau. Logan Couture isn't even playing because he's hurt anymore. They traded Tomas Hertl, for fuck's sake. The last glimpse of any of those decent Shark teams is Mark-Edward Vlasic, who, ironically, related to Alex Vlasic. They have had multiple seasons of top 10 draft picks. The Hawks haven't gotten there yet. This year, them being bad is another step in getting that big-time talent. Yeah, it sucks. I'm just as frustrated as the next person. But when you look at the Sharks to the Blackhawks right now, with Celebrini to Bedard, it's apples to oranges. They're at a different phase in their rebuild. They've had multiple top high-end draft picks. Will Smith, Will Eklund. You went out and got a guy like Mikael Granlund. You took on a lot of bad contracts and a lot of draft picks over years to get to where the Sharks are now. And they're still a bad hockey team coming out of the rebuild. When you go all out and sell your soul to the fucking devil for 3 Stanley Cups, and then your GM rides mediocrity for 4 seasons after that, this is what happens. Trust me, I don't like it just as much as the next person. But if you're going to bitch and moan and make these outlandish fucking takes about you would rather have Celebrini and buddy Adam Fantilli, who's got like 14 points to his name as an NHL player, over Bedard, you clearly don't understand how hockey development fucking works. So to all the jabronis out there who don't understand how hockey development works, I hope you take this class, apply it to the back of your skull, and think about it a little bit before you say dumb shit. Because it is unbelievable how few hockey people understand that hockey players take time to develop. This thing isn't a magical turnaround. They didn't have prospects in the pool already before Bedard. Bedard was the crown jewel, but he was the first piece of the puzzle, not the last piece. Or not even somewhere in the middle, like you could argue a Macklin Celebrini is. Realistically, and this is going to pain a lot of people, here's where we really ruffle the feathers of the 85%. Realistically, Connor Bedard makes his first playoff appearance as a 22-year-old. He's 19. That's probably the realistic timeline for this team actually being competitive, because they literally had nothing to build it off of. And we can all thank Buddy Stan Bowman for that. The guy that I remember people back in 2015 called me crazy for saying he was a terrible general manager. And of course, he lived long enough to see himself become the villain and completely destroy this Blackhawks franchise's prospect pool and immediate future. It sucks. I know, but they have to pick high in the draft to get that talent and then supplement it with free agents. Hockey development takes time. I know it sucks. I hate it just as much as the rest of the people. As a matter of fact, I'm going to go bash my head off the wall after this episode because of this. But these outlandish takes need to fucking stop. They're ridiculous. Thank you for coming to my class today. Tony, do you want to ruffle any feathers as well?
I think you ruffled a lot. I've got some maybe takeaways from the class to discuss if you're open for office hours. But
sure.
You state a lot of fact here, Ron, that things are going to take time. My biggest fear is that finding a piece like Connor Bedard early on leaves this group exposed to failing with that pick in the long term a lot more than it does when you bring in a Macklin Celebrini on the back end, or if Connor Bedard was drafted into the back end of a rebuild. I wanted the team to get super aggressive with the entry-level contract years for Connor Bedard and load up some contracts that were high-performing players, goal scorers, to assemble at least 2 competent scoring lines and maybe try and just sneak their way into the playoffs. Obviously, that's not the right way or the real way to go about it. And I think that Kyle Davidson, for better or for worse, has really given himself, and this is what irks me a little bit with it, and I know that you have to be patient with it, but it irks me because I watched this with Rick Hahn and the Chicago White Sox with a rebuild where you have a GM who can basically dictate their career timeline based on the rebuild. And as a sports executive, this seems to be like the ultimate way to get your way for a long time. And, there's another team in this city with a GM who's got themselves some potential runway. And I think maybe his runway could be running out. But you look at what Kyle Davidson's done. You sit here and you say the most realistic time frame for Connor Bedard to reach the playoffs is when he's 22. He's already on a new contract at that point. So you don't have the cap space to work with that you did in this environment anymore. You also have a GM who's going to want to sort of, that's his crop of draft picks coming in. Those are his guys that are coming up in the system. And there's nothing more that sports teams can do. You don't fire a GM in the middle of a rebuild where the Blackhawks are at right now, because you need some continuity with the plan. I think that that's a crutch with this team. And that's what frustrates me a little bit. It's not the fact that, the talent hasn't gone the way that we needed it to, and it's going to take longer to develop. It's that I think that they could have been a little bit more aggressive to try and be, closer to a 500 hockey team. The problem with that is on the back end, and I'm fully well aware of it, is you sacrifice that draft capital. You're sacrificing the top 10 picks if you got aggressive that way. But it's basically like the Chicago Bears offense. They're punting just as much as the Chicago Bears offense is right now, just years and years and years into the future. Now, we're not going to be able to look into our crystal balls and say, well, it's a guarantee that Connor Bedard's in the playoffs at 22. There's a lot of things that can happen in between now and then where shit can go awry. Things can magically get better. Guys have some career years. You don't know. But just looking at it right now, you're probably not far off, because I would say, and what is that? 28, 29? Somewhere around there. Might even be closer to 2030 if we're really looking at things before the Hawks are potentially a perennial playoff team. That's a lot of time. It's a lot of patience that you're asking a fan base to have with you. So you don't hear the organization come out and state, guys, it's going to take 5 years, because then you start putting clocks on things. And so my problem with this is, while fully well aware that this is going to take some time, there needs to be a show of good faith. And I think that they really fucked it up when they went out and asked for another Winter Classic in Chicago to put this spectacle on ice called 2024-2025 Blackhawks hockey on everyone's television on New Year's Eve outdoor at Wrigley Field and have all of the national hockey media around the legit shit show that has been this team all year. Probably should have waited a couple of years before they did that.
You know what the craziest part is too, Tone? I think the NHL purposely knew that the Hawks were shit too, because they scheduled it on New Year's Eve when there was like 15 other hockey games instead of it being the habitual January 1st event where it's a standalone event. It's almost like the NHL played the, hey, we know better card, and we're going to distract people in case this game goes south, where you can tune into 7 other more hockey games the rest of the night if you really want to get your fix.
Yeah, that was a debacle too, and that was, I think, the lowest watched Winter Classic in a while. Be interesting to see what they do with it. A couple of notes on the Winter Classic, though, Ron, as we turn the page away from this. I think my final statement is I don't like the fact that Kyle Davidson has such a long leash and put himself into a position where, like it or not, he's going to deserve that long leash, and there's not much that can really change it in the next 2 years. I don't see them looking at the end of this season and saying, wow, Kyle Davidson didn't get us to the playoffs. It's time to part ways with him. There's a lack of accountability for the on-ice products because it's designed to not be good. But then in certain breaths, especially earlier this season, there was talk of we don't want to finish near the bottom of the league. So it's mixed messaging, and that's what gets me. But flipping the page to the Winter Classic stuff for I guess, lack of a better term here, I just wanted your sort of fan experience recap of that, and I can give a couple of takes for mine as well. I think it was definitely a pretty sight. I think the NHL did a great job setting everything up. There was the loudest group of Hawks fans that I think I can say that I've been around since the playoff days. It was an electric atmosphere to start the game. Everything else from there went to crap. It was cold. It was rainy. It was not pleasant outside by any stretch of the imagination where we were sitting. But overall, I think that, from being there, I didn't get the sense that it was going to be the least watched Winter Classic. How about you?
Yeah, I think the fan experience of being on site was incredible. Truly, I thought it was an awesome event. I think they did it beautifully. I think Wrigley looked fantastic for it. It was cool seeing all the red. There was a lot of red. I mean, there was still a lot of Blues fans there, and as there should be. It's an easy trip for St. Louis fans. I would understand wanting to be there as well. But it was a good atmosphere, and there was a competitiveness even amongst the fans that I think was healthy, right? You'd hear the Let's Go Hawks chants or the Let's Go Blues chants start, and the other fan base would try to drown them out as best as possible. It was a great atmosphere. I think the day itself was awesome. Everything outside of the product on the ice was fantastic. It's just, for some reason, it appeared that the Hawks were unable to play on the ice surface, and the Blues figured out what was working and executed. And maybe that's a coaching thing, right? Obviously, Jim Montgomery versus an Anders Sorensen, but the Blues figured out how to play on the bad ice and made it work to their advantage. Don't get me wrong, it didn't hurt that Jordan Binnington stood on his head in that game as well.
Made a couple of very, very clutch saves, especially earlier on in that game, and the Hawks offense took a little bit of time to get moving, but
it did. So I think, again, outside of the outcome of the game, everything was awesome. I think it was well done. I'm glad to say that we were in attendance for it. I don't have a regret of like, oh, what the hell did I pay that money for? Like, the environment was still worth the experience. It just sucks that the Hawks didn't even at least show up to play. I could have stomached the 6-4 loss at least if they came to play. They just didn't even look like they came to play.
I think I was probably the most angry as a Hawks fan in a long time by the time I got home. I will say that. I was not happy.
I know. I got those text messages from you.
I'm sure you got those. Yeah, you remember those.
I do. Speaking of that, Tony, unless you have more thoughts on the Winter Classic, do you have any stick taps? Are we even at a point where there's no stick taps from Mr. Marchese?
I don't think that this team deserves any stick taps right now. There's one guy I'll let you take that one that I think can get some stick taps, but outside of that, man, I'm not giving out stick taps until the morale improves.
Understood and totally fair. I will give a quick stick tap to the captain, Nick Foligno. The fight at the Winter Classic was awesome. I think the story behind it's even more fun because like they were talking about shaking hands, and obviously it was captain versus captain, and Shen wanted the fight and Foligno took him up on it. And I think that was pretty cool. And at least it felt like Foligno was trying, right? And then obviously he turns that around in the Friday night win over the Canadiens, 2 goals, almost had a hattie. Just the empty net was torturing him, it felt like, in that game. And then obviously the remarks after the game. Say what you want, I think, about the effort that this Hawks team has given all year, but like you can tell Nick Foligno cares, and he wears that C with pride. And at least as a fan, that's a guy that you can grip onto and be like, at least he's a player that you appreciate having on your hockey team. Like you said earlier, Tony, this isn't a team of hateable guys. It's really not. And I think Foligno is kind of that top dog in that sense, of just like, yeah, he's at the other end of his career and he's up there in age, but like you could tell he really cares. And like that means something to people in Chicago when somebody, especially a player wearing a C, gives a shit the way that I think Foligno does about the fans and about the organization as a whole and the guys on the roster. So I think that in itself, especially when your team's playing bad hockey and it's really hard to get up for these games. And I get it. I know what it's like to be on bad teams. I've been on bad teams as an athlete in my life before. Kudos to him for still showing that wherewithal that he gives a shit. And I think that's worth an appreciation from the fans, and at least from myself. That is for certain. Tony, our 4 feathers prediction tracker. We did not do so hot. we did not do so hot.
Dumpster fire.
That was bad. Fire. It was bad.
You had 3, I believe. Right. I had 2 and 1.
You had 2 and 1, yeah. So we were unfortunately, yours had a better chance.
Brutal.
Yeah, it was brutal. Yours had a better chance. I felt like yours might still have an opportunity after that Sunday game. I was like, well, maybe they come back in the Winter Classic and then, get a win against Montreal. They did get the win against Montreal, but obviously not so much to be said on the other end. But Tony, we have 4 games coming up here as a part of our new set of prediction tracker. Probably will not be back on the microphone with people before then. One of them is a doubleheader along the way. This Wednesday, so tomorrow or today, if you're listening to the show on Wednesday, January 8th, it is a home game against the Colorado Avalanche that is on TNT. So for those that do not have CHSN access, you can watch the Hawks. It's a 6:30 Central Time start because that is a TNT doubleheader. So there's a later West Coast game.
Watch the Hawks.
Yes, if you want to watch the Hawks.
We're not recommending. Yeah, we're not recommending or telling you that it's necessary watching, but if you choose to do so, you can.
And the sickos that we are, we will probably watch that game. So that's a 6:30 start. And Tony, I have a little bit of a tinfoil hat take after I read all these off. Friday, they're in Detroit. Obviously, that is a time zone ahead on the East Coast, or the Eastern time zone, I should say there. So that's a 6 o'clock start Central Time. That's on CHSN on Friday night. So you'll get to see Patrick Kane and Alex DeBrincat up at Little Caesars Arena. I have been to that arena before. It's actually a very pretty stadium. On that other note, the Blackhawks are back home then on Saturday. It's a 6 o'clock Central Time start against Edmonton. That's also on CHSN, and then they're back home again on Monday against Calgary. That's a 6:30 Central Time start on CHSN as well. Tony, I think part of the reason this Blackhawks team has struggled this year is because the Blackhawks are scheduling all these games at weird fucking times. Enough of the 2 o'clock starts, enough of the 6:30 Friday night starts. If it's a 6 o'clock game, it better be on a Sunday. Otherwise, it better be at 7 o'clock. We'll go back to that. But I think that's messing with the team. You get into a routine, you become a creature of habit and get into a rhythm. When you're having to play at different hours of the day, it's got to mess with you. You play at 7:30 on one night, and then you play at 4 o'clock because of the Winter Classic. And then you play at 7:30 on Friday, or 7 o'clock on Friday night. They show up and win, but then they got to play at 2 o'clock on Sunday, and things go south. So just neither here nor there. But those are the 4 games coming up here, Tony. So what is your record prediction? Colorado, Detroit, Edmonton, Calgary. 3 of these are at home, mind you, as well.
I'm going 1-3, man. 1-3. I feel like it's time to start going back to the realistic picks. I know we went with some optimism and hope, and I think some of that was surrounded by a little bit of Winter Classic magic that we thought would happen. There were no miracles. I've got to get back to basics here and separate myself from Johnny on the stat tracker. So I'm going to go 1-3. I do actually like your tinfoil hat there. I believe I mentioned this on one of the last shows that there was a game before the Winter Classic in our last set that we were talking about. Tyler Bertuzzi scored a goal exactly at 7:30 on the dot. I think it was a 6:30 start. And I said, that's interesting.
Buffalo. Yep.
I was like, that's interesting. 7:30 local time. All of a sudden the Hawks had shown up to play. So yeah, there's a lot of examples as to why this year's schedule has been just sort of nightmarish. It's got all sorts of little twists and turns. But Ron, I'm here. I'm really curious to hear your predictions for this one.
It's been a while since I've gotten some points, and I think the last time I got points, I included an overtime loss. So we're going to go back to those roots again. We're going to go 1-2-1 in the next 4. I think they lose to Colorado. I just think the Avs are a better team. I think they lose to Detroit only because it's on the road. I don't know which way it's going to go, but they're going to win one against Edmonton or Calgary, and then they're going to lose an OT in the other. I think that's how it's going to ultimately shake out. So I'm going to say 1-2-1, and hopefully I can climb back up. And then we got tree out of all of us there with correct predictions, since I'm the only one stuck at 2 at the moment. So, Tony,
there you have it.
Always a blast. Lots to cover here in this show. It was a bit of a long one, but we had to catch up, obviously, after the holidays, after the Winter Classic, and all that good stuff. We were hoping to get back to everybody with some thoughts post-Winter Classic. Didn't work out because of the holiday season, but we're back. We're back in swing. We're back in schedule, and we will see you guys probably around this time next week after these 4 games. Once again, on tapsportsnet.com and at 4featherspod is where you can find us. And be sure to tune in and tune along. And if you like what we're doing, again, comment on the YouTube video, and don't be afraid to rate and review those podcasts wherever you listen to them. Tony, it was a blast despite the Hawks being bad. But remember, A's are only for effort, and we need to see more effort out of this Blackhawks team at the end of the day. What do you say, my friend? Do we get out of here and let's go Hawks?
Let's go Hawks.